Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Gordon. I work for the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming to hear about freshwater mussels, and happy Friday. Without further ado, let's get started. So, at its simplest, we probably first need to address what exactly is a mussel. Here on the right, you can see one in the palm of a biologist. Freshwater mussels are a type of animal known as bivalves. Probably already know some other bivalves such as clams and seafood mussels, the kind that you might get from a store to eat. However, it's important to note that seafood mussels are not the same as the freshwater mussels that we have in West Virginia. Among other distinctions, seafood mussels have beards, and they use those to attach to usually a hard place, and they will stay in that one place for their life. Whereas our native mussels have a foot, which extends from their shell when they're relaxed and happy, and they can use that foot to move around. Some sources state that certain mussels can move as much as about 3 feet in an hour, which for something so small and something that we think of as never moving, I think that's pretty impressive. Why are these organisms important? Why should we care about them? They provide habitat for other river organisms such as bugs, plants, and fishes. They help remove pollution from the water and bank it into the sediment on the bottom of their home in the water. And our mussels can even help stabilize the rivers they live in. So from these couple of facts that I've given you already, you can probably kind of figure out that these animals are actually really important to the health of our waters in West Virginia. But unfortunately, a lot of them are endangered or threatened, which means if we don't change something about what is happening with them, we run the risk of possibly losing them forever, which would be very sad and kind of scary. Next up, I'm going to talk about how we monitor our mussels. But first, I'd like to share some cool mussel facts with you guys to kind of get your brains churning and maybe get you a little bit excited about mussels like I am. So our native West Virginia mussels can be down to as small as your pinky finger, and some of them can get all the way as big as maybe like a dinner plate. Some of the mussels in our state are actually older than many of your grandparents, which is fascinating. You wouldn't think something little like that would live for so long, but they really do. And maybe the coolest thing about them is that even though they are standalone animals, they actually need the help of another kind of animal in order to reproduce. So they actually rely on native fishes that also live in the system with them in order to have offspring. And they do that through kind of tricking the fishes with something called a lure. And here's a picture of a mussel lure. And at this point, before I move on, I'll give you guys a couple seconds in case there's already some questions in the chat, but I know probably not. It's been pretty quick, but I'll give you a minute. All right. There's another opportunity at the end. So if you did have a question and it got missed, that's okay. We'll come back to it. So I'd like to talk to you guys about what we at the West Virginia DNR are doing to try and make sure what I referenced earlier about the mussels maybe disappearing, we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we go out and we monitor their populations, which is the group of the animals in a given place. And this is a pretty typical site for us, a little bit of a river here that we would go out to and check the population. And so the way that we do that is we check the same place year after year so that we can compare them to see if there's a change that we need to be aware of. To do that, it's very important that we're checking the exact same spot. So what we'll do is we'll set up a grid like this on your screen, and we'll do that with rebar, like pieces of metal that will drive into the bottom of the water to make a stake that we can tie these lines off to, and then we make a grid that we can search. And again, it's very important. This is going to be the same grid year after year, so we can compare them, and it's a meaningful comparison. So what we'll do is we'll set up the grid, and then a bunch of biologists will go out there, and they'll have swim gear on and snorkels and masks, and they will move through those grids, and they will search the grid and try and capture every mussel in that grid, which sounds pretty easy, right? We know that they at most can move maybe 3 feet in an hour, so it shouldn't be very hard to catch an animal like that, right? Well, you would think so, but it can be a lot more difficult than you might think. So here is a picture of a mussel. I'll give you guys a second to see if you can spot the mussel. And so here is the animal that we're talking about. This is often what they look like when they're in their home, buried in the sediment at the bottom of a river or a stream or a creek. And if that one isn't tough enough to see on its own, it can be even harder to spot them. And this is a good illustration for two different reasons. So first of all, if you can see where I'm tracing right here, that is all of that part of the mussel that was out of the bottom. So you only have this much that you can find. And as you can see, the algae on there really complicates matters a lot more, because this individual has excellent natural camouflage. Now, that's not to say that this mussel chose to have that algae grow on it, but the algae kind of works together with that mussel. The mussel gives the algae a place that it can grow, and in return, that algae will help the mussel not be found by predators like muskrats or otters. So I was talking about those grids a minute ago, and this is a grid that has been completed. It's already been looked through, and we found hopefully all the mussels that were in it, or at least as many as we could. So you can kind of see these lines through the water there, and that's the setup of the grid that I was talking about. But probably a lot of you are looking at this stuff in the water and wondering what that is. And so, like I said before, we're going back there year after year to check how these animals are doing. And as a result, in order to draw meaningful conclusions from our research there, our monitoring, we have to be sure that we aren't making a problem for them ourselves. So what we do when we go out and we gently capture these animals is each time we pull one out of the bottom, we have a little surveying flag, like you might see at construction. And so we push that little flag into the hole that the mussel came out of, so that once we're done working up the mussel, we can send it back to the exact quad, the part of the grid that it came out of, and then we can put it back into a hole where a mussel belongs, so that we know that we have taken this animal out of the water, and now we're putting it back into a place that is suitable for a mussel to live. In theory, because they can move, if you put them back anywhere in the grid, they might be able to find their way back to a place that they like. But by taking this little extra step to try and put them back in a place that we know mussels belong, hopefully we're making them expend less energy. They don't have to work as hard to get back to a place where they're happy and able to survive. So after we've searched through one of those quads, we put them into a bag, and you can see here that that bag is labeled with the quad that it came out of, so that we can make sure that those animals get back roughly where they belong. And then we take them to a station where we do a bunch of things to check how healthy they are. So we've got one person here is measuring a mussel, and then another is putting a tag on a mussel, a unique individual identifier for that animal. And then we have this third person recording both the measurements and the tags. Before we move on, I'd like to point out another thing. We were talking about, how we have to make sure that we're not hurting them. And so, as we already know, these animals live underwater. So throughout the process, we do the most that we can in order to make sure that they stay in the water so that we're not hurting them and messing up our own perception of how the community is doing on its own. So we measure them and we put them back in the water. We tag them, and these won't be on the table for very long. And then we put them back in the water. And the whole system is designed so that we're putting as little stress on the animal as possible. And here's a picture of a pretty big mussel. You can see that's an adult's hand right there. And it has one of those unique identifier tags on it that I was talking about. So the reason that that's important is next time we see this individual, W105, we will measure it again. And generally, mussels that are happy and healthy grow faster than ones that aren't. So from those measurements and having that unique tag, next time we find W105, we'll check its size. And if it's grown a lot, we can kind of assume that that animal is probably happy and doing pretty well there. But, maybe if we find it again and it's not grown at all, we can compare that with the other organisms in that area, the other mussels, and if all of them are growing really slowly, then we can kind of guess that maybe something bad is happening there, and we can start to dig into that and look around and see, maybe there's a lot of construction upstream that's putting too much dirt in the water, which sometimes can mess with them. Or maybe there could be some kind of pollution nearby, like chemicals or something bad. And so by measuring these, we can kind of get an early warning that something might be bad before it becomes a really bad thing that might wipe them out there, which would be very difficult to recover from. So I want to thank Craig Styler, who took so many of these awesome pictures and allowed me to share them with all of you. And this picture kind of serves to show that it's not just mussels we find. We find so many cool things while we're out there. It's a really neat job. This was an arrowhead that we found while we were snorkeling in a river, and it was kind of accidental almost. We were picking up mussels and it just made it into the bag. We found it at the processing station. But we get to see so many cool things out there. And if you ever get the chance to do something like this, I highly recommend it. You'll see so many neat things and learn a lot more about the water around you. I also want to thank Appalachian Headwaters for inviting me to share my work and help you guys learn about what we're doing to try and protect the water around you. And I want to thank all of you for listening to my story, which was inadvertently a little shorter than I intended. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them now.
We do have a few questions, Brian, and this has been so fascinating and useful for me as well. Some of you all know that we run a summer camp and on the Greenbrier, and there are mussels there, and it's all we can do to keep the kids from picking up the mussels along the river. But I'm just so curious about them. And
Sure.
we have a few questions that might help, I think, in that department about you were speaking to. It's important to put them back where, or at least the type of habitat where you found those mussels when you record your observations.
Yes.
You mentioned that they will grow faster, and you take note of that, the ones that you track. How does the mussel grow? Like, how would you be able to tell that the mussel has grown faster or grown at all?
So that's a great question. So let me see if I can Okay, can you see my mouse on the screen right now? Very good. So we have this special measuring device called calipers. I don't have one nearby, or I would show you the actual thing, but you can think of it kind of like a ruler. So there's many ways you can measure a mussel, and different organizations will use different metrics or different ways to measure theirs. But what we do is we measure them from front to back. So this is the back of the mussel here, and this is the front. And so what you do is you hold the mussel in one hand and you hold the calipers up, and you can get a length of the mussel. And from that, you can kind of tell. But to address the question of how they grow, you can also see on this individual here, you can see all these rings. And so those represent periods of growth. A lot of people will say that you can count the rings to tell how old they are. That's actually a little bit contentious in the field of the science, mostly because stress events outside of just seasonal change can cause them to put those rings down. So if you're in a highly stressed system, you might think that you have really old mussels that have actually just been through a lot of cycles of stress. But essentially, they just put on these new rings of shell over time and get bigger and bigger, both this way and lengthwise.
That's interesting. Another question here about the picture that you're showing also on that same slide. What are those claw-like things in the mouth of the mussel?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I can't actually tell you. I learned about it recently myself, but I'm afraid my memory of that learning might not be up to date. So I don't want to tell you guys the wrong thing. But they are super cool. And if I had to hazard a guess, I would maybe say that they might help that mussel not ingest things that it doesn't want to, like sand. But I'm not certain about that.
How much do we know? This is a personal question, so I'm sticking this one in there before we get to a few others. How much do we know about the diversity of mussels that are already there that are here in West Virginia today?
So we believe that we're aware of all the species that are in our region. But that's one of those things where you never know that you don't know something. So there could be more there that we haven't found yet, but we have a pretty large database of mussel records that go all the way back to, I think, the 1890s. So we have a really long-term set of data about these populations and the animals that make those populations up. And that's pretty cool because we can see how those proportions have changed over time. We can also see how more people moving into the region and setting it up for people has kind of changed how well adapted it is for mussels. A good example would be the Mon River. Used to be a lot more diverse and have much higher abundance or numbers of animals in it. But as we kind of polluted it and set it up for barge traffic, we didn't exactly wipe out the mussels, but we certainly made them much fewer, which is something that we are currently working to kind of reverse. We're hoping we can find a middle ground where people can still be happy living on and around the Mon, but also we can maybe restore it to a place where the mussels can be happy too.
That was a great lead into another question we got, Brian, which was, are there things that we can do that humans can do to improve the habitat for mussels? Kind of like putting your Christmas tree in a pond for fish habitat, something like that, that people have done. Is there anything that just average people could do to help with that?
I'm sure there are. Unfortunately, the largest impacts are going to be made by larger groups, organizations, construction companies, chemical companies. However, if you are an individual and you want to try and make your local streams and rivers and lakes and ponds healthier, I would highly encourage you to check for your local watershed group, which is often a organization made up of individuals like yourselves who can work together to accomplish much larger goals than you would have been able to as an individual. These organizations are extremely valuable to the natural resources around us. And by working together with your neighbors for a common goal like that, you can probably make a really big difference. So I encourage you to check for your local watershed group and reach out. Even if they don't have a project that you might be interested in, they can probably put you in touch with someone who does.
That's great. Brian, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump over to some other earlier questions that
Absolutely.
just kind of jump right back to, you mentioned about bivalves and clams. That's something that I don't know that I could tell the difference between a clam and a mussel. Could you describe that?
So I haven't worked much with clams, so I'm not sure that I'm really well qualified to tell you guys about the difference between them. And to be honest, if I found a clam in one of my sites, I would have a hard time picking them apart at first. However, we don't have any clams in our freshwater here, so that would be a dead giveaway. If I did find it, it would probably be because maybe someone nearby was having a picnic and they threw their clamshells in the water. And sometimes that does happen. We find, fake out mussels sometimes, like pistachio shells or oysters, and those can be pretty surprising and throw a little loop in our day when we find those at first. But yeah, clams can look very similar to mussels, and I think the first thing that I would look at is where you found the animal to draw that distinction.
That helps me not assume that something could be a clam here in West Virginia in the fresh water.
Actually, I'm sorry, I have to interject. We do have fingernail clams. I'm not sure if those are native or not, but if you look inside the shell, this is kind of getting into the weeds, but a biologist could tell the difference because they'll have these things called, I think, cardinal teeth, which is a structure that they have two of, and mussels only have one. Sorry, that's not something your average person would be able to look at and identify.
Here's another question related to what we were just talking about. Are the shells reused? All the time I see, a half shell laying around, and I didn't know if that was reused by mussels or by any other as habitat for other critters.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. They won't be reused by other mussels, not directly, but they are very helpful to the environment. They will become a part of the bed of the river, which can, I think, if you have enough mussels, it can probably change your water chemistry a little bit because they have a lot of calcium in them. And that's another thing that these animals need to grow. So I would think indirectly, they do kind of get reused as they weather. They would probably make more of that compound available in the water to other animals, so that the mussels could probably pick that back up and incorporate that into their own shell. But certainly not like a hermit crab. You're never going to see a mussel, leave its shell and move into another one that likes better. They can't do that. That would not work.
Okay, so I have a couple questions that I guess could be related, but they're more about you. So as we were talking before your presentation, Brian, I learned that you were a fisherman, and I wondered if there was any information for a mussel biologist like you, any information that you get about fishing from the mussels that you see around where you might fish.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So yes, generally, if you find a place that has a lot of mussels in it, that's usually a very healthy place. So if you know of a place near you that is covered in mussels on the bottom, it's probably worth spending some extra time fishing there. It tells you generally, especially if you have a lot of different mussels, if they look different from each other, it probably means that they have a lot of different fish in there. And if you have a lot of different fish, it usually means that your fish community is more healthy. So um, we talked, or I mentioned earlier that mussels trick fish with a lure to reproduce. And one of the interesting things about them is there's a high degree of what people call host specificity, which is just a fancy term for certain mussels like certain kinds of fish in order to reproduce. So yeah, if you have a lot of different mussels because of that host preference and because they like certain fish to reproduce, you can kind of assume that there's probably a lot of different fish there, which probably means it's a good place to fish.
So I take from what you're saying, Brian, that if there were no fish, then there wouldn't be able to, because the mussels rely on the fish to reproduce. The mussels couldn't survive there if there were no fish?
That is an excellent question and a very astute observation. One of the things that kind of gets us in trouble with that kind of thinking, though, is you might remember earlier I mentioned that there's actually a fair number of mussels in this state which are older than some people's grandparents. And the fact that they can't reproduce doesn't necessarily mean that they die off immediately. So in some cases, we have maybe an 80-year-old population of mussels, which can no longer reproduce. And if you were to just go there and look at them and you saw all these mussels, you would think that it's a really healthy system and that the mussels are doing great. But the way that we, excuse me, the way that we go in there and we measure all the different mussels, that kind of helps us look at it in a different way just from growth. We can see if all we have are these dinner plate sized mussels, for example, and there's no smaller mussels of that same species, then we can tell that something is wrong there, that they're not able to reproduce. Now, we would have to look further into that to see, maybe I could get in touch with my coworkers that work with fish and have them come out and do a survey, see if the fish are there for them to reproduce, or we might have to do some extensive water quality testing to see if there's a chemical issue that's keeping them from being able to reproduce. But the short answer is that just because the the system isn't set up for reproduction does not mean that there won't be any mussels there. So you can have legacy populations.
That makes sense to me now that you explained it. I just had one other question, and again, this is coming from me. It just seems like I would never have imagined that you all would need to put the wetsuits on and snorkel. That sounds like a lot of fun. But I know that there's a lot more involved in that kind of work. And I guess, what is your favorite part about working with mussels? Is there any particular part of it that you enjoy the most?
Wow, that's a great question. So I think my answer would be in two parts. I think the most fun is definitely when we're in these really clear streams. It's really nice when it's in the height of summer and it's comfortable getting in the water. But it's not all fun. Sometimes we're in water that's like, as cold as like 58 degrees. And we really have to put on a lot of protection so we, the biologists, can safely measure these animals. So the one part would, yeah, definitely be I really enjoy finding the animals and measuring them and learning about them. But then the second part that's really exciting to me is when I get back to the office and I have all these pages and pages and pages of data about the animals that we measured in a single place. And I can put that data into a spreadsheet or a database, and I can start to compare that to the previous data that we've collected there. It's really exciting to me. I feel almost like a detective. I'm uncovering the mystery of what's happening there with those animals. And I can tell only by looking at the data how they're doing. Because if you just kind of look at the animals, you may miss some important things that you can only get by looking at the whole picture with all the measurements and stuff.
Awesome. Well, I told a lie. There's one other question that I had, which is, Brian, is there any resource that you'd recommend to anybody on this that was interested more in learning more about mussels in West Virginia?
I believe that there's some information on mussels on the West Virginia DNR website, which I think would just be wvdnr.gov. You could go on there and check that out. I know that we have mussels on there, but we just updated the website and I haven't spent a lot of time on there since it was updated. So unfortunately, I can't direct you right to that. But I think you guys send out notes after these, so I can look into that and share that information with you guys. There's also, if anybody is interested in learning a lot about mussels, there's something that Fish and Wildlife has, which is a federal organization. They have a series of about hour-long videos that talk about mussels, and it's stuff that even I, as a mussel biologist, learn a lot from. Some of them are a little more beginner friendly. I'm not sure how many videos are on there, but that's another thing that I can send you guys the link to, and maybe we can work together to establish a couple that would be good entry-level videos to watch.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. I know that I learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. And I'm going to stop the recording right now.